This is it, the ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
Hey there, before we begin tonight's story, I just want to say, thank you for being here. We care about you truly, wherever you are in the world, whatever time the clock reads. Take a breath for yourself. Now tell me quietly, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Go on, grab your coffee or maybe a warm blanket. Because this is not just a story about a scientist who turned himself into something absurd. It's a story about stillness and the sound a soul makes when it finally stops running. It began on a soft, rainy night, the kind of night where thunder doesn't roar, it hums. The world outside the Smith house was blurred by drizzle, the windows fogged from the breath of time itself. Inside, the faint buzz of a broken lamp was the only light that dared to stay awake. Morty sat at the kitchen table, his homework untouched, the numbers on the page melting into tiny rivers of graphite under his palm. Something in the house felt off. Too still, too silent, even for Rick. He called out once, twice, no answer. Then, that hum, that strange half-living hum, drifted in from the garage. When Morty pushed the door open, the air felt different. The smell of ozone and oil, the hum of half-finished experiments, all familiar. But tonight there was something missing. Rick's voice. That gruff, sarcastic, universe-breaking sound that usually filled every corner of the room like static, gone. Instead, only the faint whir of cooling metal, and a low glow beneath the workbench. Morty stepped closer, heart tapping nervously in his chest. A glass jar sat there, fogged with condensation, lit by the eerie pulse of an unsteady green light. Inside was a pickle. At first, he laughed, the kind of awkward, half-confused laugh that comes when your mind refuses to accept what it sees. But then the jar twitched just slightly. "Ah, Rick." Morty whispered, the name trembling from his lips. No answer, only the hum. He lifted the jar carefully, light spilling across his face. The pickle's surface shimmered, almost alive, faintly vibrating. A tiny spark flickered inside it, like neurons firing under glass. And then, just barely, he heard it. A whisper. Not through the air, but through the glass itself. "Morty, don't freak out." Morty nearly dropped the jar.
"Ah, Rick! What the? You're a pickle. Why are you?" "Shh!"
came the faint voice, distorted and distant. "Keep it down. Your mom's gonna think I've finally lost it." The voice crackled like old radio static, weak but unmistakably Rick's. "Had to skip therapy somehow." The whisper added, half amused, half ashamed. Morty's lips parted, confusion washing over his face. "You turned yourself into a pickle to avoid therapy." "Yeah, Morty," the voice rasped faintly. Big brain move. 10 out of 10. Very self-aware. Morty stared at the jar, blinking through the glow. Outside, the rain kept falling softly, rhythmic, gentle, endless. The hum of the machines around him seemed to merge with the heartbeat of the storm. He sat down beside the jar, not sure whether to scold or just listen. Rick's voice faded in and out, sometimes coherent, sometimes dissolving into faint electrical murmurs. "Everything's too quiet," Rick mumbled from somewhere deep in the brine. "It's weird, when you stop talking, the room starts talking back." Morty frowned. "Rick, that's not funny." Didn't say it was Morty. Just noticing things. The lights flickered. The storm outside whispered against the glass. In that soft hum, Morty thought, maybe for the first time, that Rick wasn't joking, that maybe he was lonely. He leaned closer, whispering, "What if you can't change back?" The voice chuckled faintly. "Then I guess I'll just marinate in my decisions." For a moment, both of them laughed, quietly, gently, like two people remembering something from long ago. Then silence again. A silence that didn't feel empty this time. It felt full, heavy, almost sacred. Morty set the jar gently on the desk. "I'll come back later," he said softly. "Just don't roll away." "Okay." The voice didn't answer. Only a faint bubble rose through the green liquid and then a hum, almost like a sigh. Morty turned off the lights. The lab sank into a calm half-darkness. The machines blinked slowly, like distant stars. And there, under the workbench, the jar pulsed faintly. A pickle holding the consciousness of a man too afraid to face his own reflection. The storm outside quieted to a drizzle. The world slowed its breathing, and somewhere in that quiet, between science and sorrow, a small fragment of Rick Sanchez began to drift. Not through dimensions this time, but inward. Maybe that's where he had needed to go all along. He didn't know it yet. But that night, the night Rick went missing, was the first time he was ever truly found. There are nights when sound moves slower, as if the world itself is trying not to wake you. That night was one of them. The storm outside had thinned into a misty hush, rain trailing down the window like sleepy thoughts. The garage sat quiet, filled with the soft afterglow of machines still dreaming of their creator. Morty stood there again, blanket over his shoulders, unable to sleep. He wasn't sure what drew him back. Maybe the hum, maybe the memory of that strange whisper, or maybe it was the feeling that the jar itself missed being seen. He stepped closer, his breath fogging the glass. The faint green light pulsed from within, softer now, like a heartbeat that had accepted its rhythm. Morty touched the lid gently, and this time the whisper came before he could even speak. Morty, he froze.
Why? Yeah, I'm here, Rick.
Good, the voice murmured faintly. Means the quantum brine's still stable. Didn't think it'd hold this long. Morty blinked. Rick, you're really in there, huh? A pause, then a soft chuckle. In there, out there, somewhere in between. Honestly, it's kind of peaceful. The voice had changed. Not sarcastic, not manic. Just slow, tired, almost human. Morty sat down beside the jar, the concrete cold beneath him. He rested his chin on his knees and listened as the hum filled the silence like a gentle lullaby. Rick's voice drifted in and out, the way a dream does when you're half awake. You know, Morty, the thing about silence is it doesn't let you hide. You ever notice that? Morty frowned softly.
I guess, yeah.
I used to think noise was thinking, that if I kept the machines running, kept building, kept moving, I'd never have to hear this. What's this? Myself. For a long time, there was only the sound of rain and the faint vibration of the jar. The garage smelled faintly of old coffee and metal. Morty wanted to say something comforting, something like "you'll be okay," but somehow it didn't fit. The world didn't need words right now. It just needed quiet. Rick's voice softened again, as if remembering. When I first started building portals, you know what I was trying to do? Travel the universe. No, I was trying to get closer to home. Morty tilted his head. That doesn't make sense. Yeah, tell me about it. Every world I built, every version of me. Just another way to avoid sitting in one place long enough to feel what I lost. Rick's words trembled faintly through the glass, like ripples in a pond. And now I can't move at all. Irony's a pretty funny guy. The green light flickered once, then steadied. Morty could almost feel the weight of the words sink into the room, like dust settling on forgotten memories. He leaned closer, whispering, "What are you gonna do, Rick?" "Think," the voice said simply. "About what?" "About why I turned myself into a pickle in the first place." Morty smiled weakly. "You said it was to avoid therapy." Rick chuckled, that same low, broken laugh that sounded like machinery trying to remember it was human. "Yeah, Morty. Avoiding therapy's just my hobby. Avoiding myself, that's the career." The silence after that felt almost holy. The hum of the machines blended with the rain outside, a rhythm of life too calm for a man who had spent his years defying it. Morty's eyes began to feel heavy. He rested his head on the workbench, the jar glowing beside him. Rick's voice continued, slower now, fading into memory. "You know, when I was your age, I thought genius meant never needing anyone. But turns out being smart just makes it easier to lie to yourself." Morty murmured, half asleep. "That's kinda sad." Rick's voice flickered like a candle. "Yeah, most truths are." Outside, thunder rolled softly like a sigh. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell quiet again. The night seemed to breathe with them, in slow, gentle rhythm. Morty dreamed without meaning to. In his dream, Rick wasn't a pickle. He was standing in his lab, young again, tinkering with a half-built portal gun. His hands were steady, his eyes distant, searching for something he could never quite name. Every time he opened a portal, the same image waited beyond a dinner table. Beth as a child laughing. A chair where he should have been. Morty stirred but didn't wake. The jar's glow reflected faintly in his eyelids, painting tiny green stars across his dreams. Rick's voice returned, softer than before. "If I ever get out of here, Morty, remind me not to build anything for a week." Morty smiled in his sleep.
Sure, Rick. Maybe.
Rick murmured, "We'll just sit in the garage and let things be quiet." And with that, the hum dimmed. The rain softened to a whisper. Morty's breathing evened out, calm and slow. The jar's glow faded to a pulse, one beat every few seconds, like a heart syncing with the rhythm of the night. Outside, the storm finally stopped. The clouds parted just enough to let a sliver of moonlight spill through the garage window. It landed gently on the jar, lighting it like an altar. If anyone had walked in just then, they would have seen a boy asleep beside a glowing jar, and they might have thought it strange. But to the universe, to that quiet, infinite hum beyond time, it wasn't strange at all. It was healing. For the first time in a long, long while, Rick Sanchez wasn't saving a universe. He was simply listening to one. Stillness. For someone like Rick Sanchez, it was worse than death. The next morning came slowly. The kind of morning that didn't rise, just drifted in. Pale light crept through the cracks of the garage window, settling over the workbench where the jar sat. The machines were quiet now, The storm had passed. Morty had gone upstairs at dawn, leaving Rick alone with nothing but the hum of the brine and the faint echo of his own mind. No adventures, no equations, no portal sounds humming in the background, just silence. At first he tried to treat it like any other problem. He ran simulations in his head, recalculated molecular friction, tried to distract himself with imaginary blueprints, but none of it helped. The stillness swallowed every thought. Every idea looped back to one unbearable truth: he couldn't move. The world, his vast, chaotic, controllable world, had shrunk down to a glass prison the size of a melon jar, and in that silence Rick began to hear the one sound he'd spent years avoiding: his own breathing, slow, uneven, almost fragile. He hated it. There was a rhythm to life he'd forgotten, the heartbeat that existed even when you weren't building, fighting, or inventing something new. Now that rhythm filled the air around him, and for once, he couldn't drown it in noise. He tried to make jokes to himself the way he used to with Morty. Well, Rick, you've finally done it. Turned yourself into the pinnacle of human evolution, an actual vegetable. Real progress, ha! But the jokes fell flat. There was no one to hear them, no one to laugh. A tiny air bubble floated through the brine, catching the sunlight like a memory. Rick watched it rise to the surface, then burst softly with a pop. It was such a small thing, so meaningless, and yet he felt something twist in his chest. Is this what he had become? A mind floating inside a jar, waiting for the next breath to break. He tried to remember why he'd done this to himself. Why he'd chosen to become a pickle. Avoiding therapy, sure, that was the joke. But deep down, there had been something more. He'd wanted to escape. Escape from the mess, from Beth's eyes that looked too much like regret, from Morty's trembling hope every time Rick promised he'd be better next time. Rick didn't run from danger. He ran from reflection. And now reflection was all that was left. The hum of the garage changed slightly as the morning warmed. The air felt thicker, alive with dust motes dancing lazily in the light. Each one reminded Rick of time, slow, patient, impossible to control. He used to think time was something he could break. Now it simply passed without asking for his permission. He stared through the glass, his vision warping faintly in the curvature. The world outside was distorted, stretched, shimmering. It looked like a dream he could almost reach but never touch. He tried to think of Morty. That awkward kid with too much fear and too much heart. The way he'd said, "You'll be okay, Rick," last night before dozing off beside the jar. It was absurd, really, that this kid, out of everyone, still believed there was something in Rick worth saving. Rick scoffed at the thought. "You don't save people like me, Morty," he muttered under his breath. "You just put them somewhere quiet." And yet a strange calm settled over him. Maybe that was the point. Maybe being quiet wasn't punishment. Maybe it was mercy. He drifted in that thought for a while, long enough that the sunlight shifted angles across the workbench, crawling slowly like the hand of a clock. For the first time in his life, Rick wasn't inventing, destroying, or running. He was simply being. Hours passed like minutes. The hum of the world outside grew distant: cars, birds, wind, faint laughter from the house upstairs. All of it blended into a soft orchestra of life that went on without him. Then Rick realized life had always gone on without him. It always would. He tried to resist the thought, to fight it the way he always did, but his body couldn't move. He had no tools, no gadgets, no portals to jump through. The only weapon left was his mind, and even that was turning against him. He thought of his daughter again. Beth, her face when she was little, holding a wooden toy he'd built her. She had said, "It doesn't have to fly, Daddy. I just like that you made it." He remembered the way he'd laughed, too busy calibrating something else to really hear her. And now that memory hurt, deeply, quietly, like an old wound that had finally stopped bleeding but never healed. The silence grew heavier. For a moment Rick wished he could cry, not because of pain, but because maybe tears could move. He had built universes, but he couldn't rebuild himself, and yet something inside him shifted. A small, strange gratitude, the kind you feel when you finally stop fighting the current and just float. Maybe this was what he'd been running from all along. Stillness wasn't the enemy. Stillness was the mirror. He looked around the lab again. His trophies of chaos, inventions that had changed worlds and ruined them too. They looked smaller now, almost quaint. "I guess this is it," he whispered. The genius reduced to observation. Then soft, not a bad way to start over. The hum deepened, not from the jar but from somewhere else. A vibration in the floor. Life. Rick let it wash through him. He listened not as a scientist but as a man. And in that quiet, fragile hour, between invention and introspection, Rick Sanchez did something he hadn't done in years. He forgave himself. Not fully, not forever, but enough to breathe again. The jar pulsed faintly, a ripple of light moving through the brine. It wasn't magic or science or some secret breakthrough. It was simply the universe acknowledging him. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The clouds parted just enough to let the light spill in. The world, for once, didn't demand anything from Rick Sanchez. It simply existed beside him, quiet, patient and still. And in that stillness, for the first time in a very long time, Rick stopped trying to fix the silencer and let it fix him. Rain returned that night. Not the kind that screams against windows, but the kind that whispers. Slow, rhythmic, like an old lullaby the world hums to itself. The drops slid down the glass walls of the garage, trailing silver threads through the dim light. The air smelled of dust and wet earth. Rick lay there, still a pickle, surrounded by quiet machines that blinked lazily, their circuits humming like the low notes of a forgotten song. Hours earlier he had accepted the silence. Now, the world offered him something new, companionship in the most unexpected form. It began with a sound, a faint scratching near the base of the workbench. At first, Rick ignored it. He assumed it was just another reminder of decay, another thing falling apart in the universe that couldn't hold still. But then he saw them, tiny shapes emerging from the shadows. Their movements soft, deliberate, curious, a family of rats, 2 adults and 3 smaller ones, sniffing through the cluttered floor in search of crumbs. Rick watched in silence, his jaw slightly fogging from the warmth inside. They moved with such unthinking grace, their little paws tapping on the concrete like raindrops. He wanted to laugh. The great Rick Sanchez, conqueror of dimensions, breaker of laws, reduced to a silent witness, watching rats go about their evening meal. But something inside him softened. The rats didn't know who he was. They didn't care. To them, he wasn't a genius or a burden or a father who had disappointed one too many times. He was just part of the world, another object among many. That realization hurt at first. Then, strangely, it soothed. He followed their movements, fascinated. The larger one, perhaps the mother, nudged the smallest rat toward a breadcrumb, guiding it gently. The way she waited for it to eat reminded Rick of Beth when she was young, when she would share half a sandwich with the neighbor's cat just because. It looked hungry. The memory stung. But it also warmed him. The rain outside grew heavier for a while, drumming a soft rhythm over the roof. The rats didn't mind. They pressed closer together under the table, tails curled, sharing warmth. Rick's reflection shimmered in the puddle forming near them, his curved glass body glowing faintly under the low blue light. For the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to be small, truly small, and still find comfort in togetherness. He had always seen the universe in equations, energy, motion, entropy. But these rats, they were living something he had spent his whole life trying to understand: connection without complexity. The smallest rat suddenly looked up at him. 2 dark eyes, wide and reflective, meeting his from the other side of the jar. For a strange moment Rick imagined it could see him, the real him, not the scientist or the cynic, but the tired being floating inside. "Hey," he whispered. Though the sound barely carried through the glass, the rat tilted its head. Then, without hesitation, it climbed onto the side of the jar and sniffed at the rim. Rick felt absurdly touched. It wasn't empathy. Not really, just curiosity. But in that moment it was enough. Something, had noticed him. The rat tapped the glass once, then scurried back to its family. Rick watched them curl into a pile of fur and breathing, their bodies rising and falling in unison. The sound, that tiny synchronized breathing, was like the heartbeat of the room. He drifted in that rhythm for a while, rain outside, breath inside, silence not as emptiness but as space to listen. A strange peace crept in, gentle, fragile, like a flame in fog. Rick began to think about how many times he had filled his life with noise just to drown out moments like this. The arguments, the experiments, the endless jumping between realities. All to avoid this simple, unbearable tenderness of being still. He thought of Morty sleeping upstairs, maybe dreaming of stars or monsters or sandwiches. He thought of Beth staring out a rain-speckled window somewhere, wondering if she had inherited more from him than she wanted to admit. And he thought of himself, the pickle, the mind, the man who couldn't stop running from quiet things. The rats stirred again, one of them crawling toward a small crack in the wall. Through it, faint light spilled in, the reflection of a street lamp outside. The glow bent through the rain like melted gold. Rick watched the light shimmer across the concrete. The world, even in its smallest corners, was still trying to be beautiful. He hadn't noticed that in years. Something within him ached to reach out, not just to move, but to touch that beauty again. To be part of it, even in the simplest way. And though he couldn't move, a thought formed, soft as a sigh. Maybe survival wasn't about escaping the jar. Maybe it was about learning to see the world from inside it. The rain slowed again. The hum of the machines dimmed, one by one, until the only sound left was the gentle dripping of water into a shallow puddle. The rats were asleep now, huddled together in a tiny heap of warmth and trust. Rick envied them, not for their freedom, but for their closeness, for their peace with what is. He looked at his own reflection in the glass, warped, faint, and small. For the first time, it didn't look cruel. It looked human. He let his thoughts blur, his mind floating just above sleep. The rain became a lullaby again. He whispered to no one, "Goss, you finally found some company, huh? Old man." A droplet slid down the side of the jar and fell onto the floor with a soft plink. It was almost like an answer. Rick smiled, not wide, not triumphant, but soft. The kind of smile that happens when you stop trying to outthink the universe and just let it hold you. The night settled deeper around him. Outside, the world exhaled. Inside, the rain slowed to a murmur. And in that quiet hour, surrounded by rats, rain, and 1,000 unspoken memories, Rick Sanchez, the loneliest man in countless realities, finally slept. When morning came, it wasn't a sunrise. It was more like the world slowly exhaling. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind the scent of iron and wet concrete. The soft hum of electricity returned to the lab. Not urgent, not chaotic, just a quiet pulse steady as breathing. Rick floated in his jar, awake but unhurried. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to rush toward a solution. The silence no longer mocked him, it waited for him. A part of him, the old restless scientist, wanted to calculate how many hours he had wasted doing nothing. But another part, newer, tender, uncertain, whispered, "Maybe this isn't wasted time. Maybe this is what healing feels like before you know it's happening." He stared at the tiny metal scraps scattered across the workbench. Once, those scraps were part of some grand invention. Now they were just leftovers, fragments of ideas too broken to matter. But to a Pickle, even broken things could be tools. He began to imagine, not in equations, not in explosions of genius, but in gentle, patient lines of thought. He envisioned tiny gears, miniature joints, small enough to be moved by air currents and memory. And in that imagining, something stirred. It wasn't ambition, it was curiosity. He couldn't move his body, but he could plan movement. He could dream it first. It started with the rats. They had returned, cautious but familiar. The smallest one dragged a sliver of wire across the floor, squeaking proudly. Rick watched, fascinated. The rat didn't know it, but it had just handed him the beginning of an idea. "Thanks, little guy," Rick muttered. His voice was faint, a vibration more than a sound. The jar hummed in response, as if acknowledging him. He began to study their movements, the way they balanced, the tiny shifts of weight in their paws, how they pushed and pulled to lift things much heavier than themselves. There was rhythm in it, logic hidden in simplicity. For the first time, Rick wasn't building something to escape. He was building something to understand. He remembered something Dr. Wong once said. Back in that sterile office with its bright lights and mint-scented air, you intellectualize your pain, Rick. You turn it into puzzles because it's easier than feeling it. At the time, he'd laughed. A big, cruel laugh, the kind that filled rooms and erased meaning. Now, her words returned quietly, without judgment. Maybe this tiny construction, this delicate patience, was a way of feeling pain without drowning in it. Hour by hour, Rick's mind shaped a design, a simple contraption of wire and discarded screws, something that could roll, pivot, or maybe even crawl. Not fast, not flashy, just alive enough to move forward. He couldn't assemble it himself, but he began to hum, soft frequencies through the jar, small vibrations that made the nearby metal tremble. The rats noticed. Curiosity glinted in their eyes. They began to nudge the pieces where the vibrations led them. Piece by piece, sound by sound, Rick guided them, not as a master, but as a collaborator. They became his small engineers, his silent team. It took hours, maybe days, time blurred. But slowly the shape formed a skeletal frame, delicate and uneven, with small pivots like knees. Rick admired its imperfection. It was honest. When it finally stood, wobbling, fragile, incomplete, something inside him shifted. He realized he had done something he hadn't in years. He had built for peace, not power. He tried to test it. The machine moved half an inch, then stopped. A small gear clicked out of place. The rats squeaked, scattering. Rick chuckled softly. "Yeah, welcome to failure, boys." But the laugh didn't sound bitter. It sounded alive. He stared at the contraption for a long time, letting the hum of the world fill the silence again. He thought about how strange it was that progress could come without explosions, without brilliance, without anyone watching. Progress could come quietly, like rain learning how to stop falling. He began to think about movement itself, how every creature learns it twice, once when they're born, and once when they've been broken. The first time you learn to crawl, it's instinct. The second time, it's grace. Somewhere above him, sunlight began to filter through a crack in the lab's ceiling. The light fell across the jar, refracting through the glass into soft golden patterns. It wasn't bright, just gentle enough to warm the air. Rick closed his eyes and let the warmth touch him. In that light, he remembered Morty, the way the kid used to stumble through portals, terrified but determined. The way he always looked back at Rick for approval, even when Rick refused to give it. Rick had always called that weakness, but now in the stillness he wondered if it was actually strength. To look back to seek connection. He thought of Beth too. Her quiet anger, her tired hope. Maybe she was the same, someone who still wanted to believe in a father who'd stopped believing in himself. Rick sighed, a tiny vibration rippling through the jar. "Guess I've been crawling my whole damn life." Outside, a bird called softly. The sound was thin but kind, a single note of existence reminding him that the world was still happening, even if he wasn't in control of it. He looked again at the fragile little machine and felt a strange pride. It wasn't functional. It didn't matter. The act itself was the miracle, to build something with care, even when no one would ever see it. The rats returned, sniffing around the edges of the contraption. One nudged a loose screw back into place. Rick smiled faintly. "You're hired." The jar glowed faintly as a low hum filled the air, not from the machines but from Rick's own resonance. A soft vibration that felt almost like laughter, almost like gratitude. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought settled in his mind like a whispered confession. "I think I'm learning to move again." The rain clouds had cleared completely now. Outside, sunlight rested on puddles, turning each one into a small mirror. Rick's reflection shimmered in the jar's curve, distorted, yes, but steady. He didn't look like a genius or a fool. He looked like someone who was finally learning how to exist without running. And as the day turned to evening, and the lab filled again with the low hum of resting machines, Rick Sanchez, the man who once ran from every silence, sat in it willingly. He didn't fix the world. He didn't save it. He simply watched the last of the sunlight fade through the glass, whispering softly to himself, 1 inch at a time, huh? The contraption made a small, accidental twitch, a little crawl forward, half alive. Rick chuckled, voice fading into warmth. Good enough. It was the kind of morning that didn't know what it wanted to be. The sun hadn't decided to shine yet, and the air still smelled like last night's rain. Morty sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty space where his backpack usually hung. It wasn't the bag he missed. It was the silence that came with it. A silence that used to be filled by Rick's voice. He could still hear it sometimes, faint and sarcastic in his memory, the mutter of equations, the sigh of impatience, the quiet, strange hum that followed him wherever he went. But this morning that hum was gone. "Mum," he called out, half hoping she'd answer with good news, half dreading that she wouldn't. Beth's voice came faintly from downstairs. "Breakfast's on the table, honey." No mention of Rick. No mention of anything missing. Morty got up, rubbed his eyes, and stepped into the hallway. The light flickered in that uneven way the house sometimes did when Rick's inventions interfered with the wiring. But today, even the flicker felt weaker. When he reached the kitchen, Summer was scrolling through her phone, hair messy, eyes glazed. "Morning, Morty," she said flatly. "You look like you didn't sleep." Morty poured cereal into a bowl. "I didn't. Rick's lab door was locked last night. That never happens." Summer looked up, unimpressed. "Maybe he finally gave himself a bedtime," Morty frowned. "No, seriously. There was thisy sound, like a low hum. Then it stopped. And I saw this jar under the table, glowing or something." Summer's spoon froze midair. "A glowing jar." "Yeah," Morty hesitated. "But when I went back, it was gone." Summer groaned. "Morty, you seriously have to stop freaking out over every science thing he does. He probably turned his consciousness into a sock or something." Classic Rick move. Morty didn't laugh. He couldn't. Something about the quiet felt wrong. It wasn't just that Rick was gone. It was that the space he left behind felt alive, like the house itself was holding its breath. Beth entered the room, still in her work scrubs. Her hair was tied up loosely, and her expression was softer than usual. "You two okay?" "Rick's missing," Morty blurted. Beth blinked. "What?" "I mean, the lab's locked, and he's not answering, and Summer says it's probably nothing, but I think—" "Morty." Beth's tone was calm, steady. "You know how your grandfather gets. Sometimes he disappears for days. He always comes back." "Yeah, but this feels different," Morty said, voice trembling slightly. "Like he's not somewhere else, like he's just gone." Beth looked at him for a long moment. Then she sighed and sat down across from him. "I used to feel that way too," she said quietly. "When I was your age, he'd disappear for months. I'd tell myself he'd call or come home, or at least leave a note. But he never did." Morty swallowed hard. "Did it get easier?" Beth smiled sadly. "You don't get used to it. You just learn to breathe between the absences." Summer rolled her eyes. "Whoa. Real comforting, Mom." Beth gave her a look that silenced any further comment. Morty stirred his cereal without eating it. I don't want him to disappear again. Beth reached over, brushing his hand lightly. He always comes back, Morty, even if he doesn't mean to. Morty nodded, but her words didn't settle in his chest. They just floated there, weightless. He needed proof. Something real. After breakfast, he slipped away quietly down the narrow hall toward the garage. The door was still locked, glowing faintly at the edges, sealed with some kind of invisible barrier. He pressed his ear to the metal. Nothing. Not even the faint buzz of machines. Rick, he whispered. The silence swallowed his voice. He tried again. If this is another weird experiment, just tell me, okay? Still nothing. Morty backed away slowly. The air in the garage felt heavy, like it remembered something he didn't. He turned and ran his hand along the side wall until his fingers brushed something cold and smooth. A screwdriver. Rick's. It was lying exactly where he'd left it last week, but now it looked different. Like an artifact instead of a tool. Morty held it tight. "Where are you, Rick?" he murmured. He thought about calling him on the portal communicator, but the last time he'd tried, Rick told him to stop panicking every time the universe goes quiet. Morty didn't want to hear that again. Instead, he just stood there, holding the screwdriver, listening to the faint ticking of the house. He could almost hear the sound of rain, though the sky outside was clear. Maybe it was in his head, or maybe somewhere, far away, it was raining on Rick. That thought made his throat tighten. Summer found him a few minutes later. "You seriously still down here?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Morty didn't look up. "You ever get the feeling that he's not as invincible as he acts?" Summer snorted. "He literally made himself God once." "Yeah, but I mean inside." Summer tilted her head, half smiling. "Morty, Rick's biggest weakness is pretending he doesn't have any." He glanced at her. "So what do we do?" Summer shrugged. "Same thing we always do. Wait. Hope he doesn't destroy the planet when he gets back." Morty wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She wasn't wrong. He looked down at the screwdriver again, then slipped it into his pocket like a keepsake. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, watching shadows crawl slowly across the walls. Every small creak of the house made him think Rick was back. That any moment, the garage door would slam open and the smell of portal plasma would fill the air. But it didn't. Only the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Morty turned on his side and whispered into the dark, "If you can hear me, Rick, just come home. Please." Outside, the rain began again, soft, rhythmic, patient. And somewhere, far beneath the surface, a faint vibration stirred inside a glass jar. Not quite sound, but memory. Maybe Rick couldn't hear Morty's words. Or maybe, in that strange, shared silence between them, he already had. It began with the sound of dripping water. Slow, steady, relentless. Rick's world had shrunk to tunnels and shadows. The damp, forgotten belly of a city that didn't care whether he existed. He'd been crawling for what felt like hours, his briny skin slick against rust and stone. His tiny mechanical limbs creaked with every motion, powered by scraps and willpower alone. Above him, the world was loud, traffic, voices, chaos. Down here, only whispers and rats. He first saw them from a distance, glowing eyes in the dark, flickering like stars in a black sea, dozens of them. Watching, waiting. Rick stopped moving. "All right, either I'm hallucinating again," he muttered, his voice echoing through the glass of his pickle body, "or I'm about to be crowned king of the sewer." The largest rat, thick, scarred, and strangely regal, stepped forward. Its whiskers twitched, and its nose quivered at the scent of vinegar and iron. Rick sighed. "Let me guess, you're the Rat King." The rat didn't answer, of course, but something in its eyes did. A strange kind of curiosity, a reflection of his own. The pack circled closer. Rick's mechanical limbs buzzed softly, ready to strike if they lunged. But they didn't. They just watched, as if deciding whether he was prey or prophet. One of the smaller rats crept near, sniffing at him. Rick stayed still. The creature tilted its head, then oddly, placed a small scrap of food in front of him. Bread, moldy but a gesture. Rick chuckled quietly. "Well, that's a first. Guess I'm not on the menu." The Rat King gave a slow nod, or maybe it was just coincidence, but Rick liked to think otherwise. He'd seen genius in alien gods and madness in men. But here, in the damp quiet of forgotten tunnels, he saw a new kind of intelligence, raw, communal, instinctive. Over the next few days, they began to coexist. Rick scavenged metal fragments and wire from the sewer debris, while the rats brought him bits of food and nesting scraps. They didn't understand his language, but they responded to his tone, his rhythm, the hum of his small machine limbs. It was a strange harmony, one born not of trust, but of mutual recognition. One night, as the sewer wind whispered through the pipes, Rick found himself staring at the Rat King again. The creature's scars looked almost deliberate, like roads carved across a map. "You're a survivor," Rick said softly. "You built a kingdom out of garbage. Guess that makes two of us." The Rat King tilted its head. Rick's reflection shimmered faintly in the puddle beside him, warped, distorted, but unmistakably his. He hated it, because in that reflection, he didn't look like a god of science or a master of worlds. He looked small, tired, afraid. "You know what your problem is, Rick," he muttered to himself. "You keep building worlds to escape the one that hurts." The rats twitched at the sound of his voice. The Rat King crept closer, nose brushing against the Pickle's glass. Rick didn't flinch. "Don't get sentimental on me," he murmured. "You'll ruin my reputation." But deep down something shifted. He'd spent his life commanding galaxies, machines, people. Now, for the first time, he was simply among. The rats didn't need him to be brilliant. They didn't care about his portals or paradoxes. They accepted him, not as a leader, not as a god, but as one of their own small, flawed, surviving. That night Rick dreamed. He dreamed of a throne made of scrap metal and pipe bones, with rats sitting in neat rows like loyal soldiers. The Rat King stood beside him, silent but proud. And for a fleeting second, Rick felt something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. When he woke, the dream clung to him like damp fog. He decided to test something. Using a bit of wire and a rusted battery, he built a tiny circuit, a pulse emitter. Each pulse sent out a gentle vibration through the metal walls like a heartbeat. The rats gathered, curious, drawn to the rhythm. Rick smiled faintly. "See that? Communication, primitive but effective." The Rat King pressed its paw against the floor, mimicking the pulse. Once, then twice. Rick froze. It was responding. He increased the frequency. 2 short pulses, 1 long. The Rat King mirrored it exactly. It wasn't language, not in any human sense. But it was connection. A silent dialogue between 2 creatures that shouldn't have understood each other at all. Rick leaned back slightly, the dim light catching on his glass surface. "Maybe I was wrong," he said quietly. "Maybe intelligence isn't about building bigger universes. Maybe it's about listening to smaller ones." He didn't believe it yet, but saying it out loud made it feel real for a moment. Hours passed. The rats fell asleep, curled together in a heap of warmth and motion. Rick sat at the edge, the faint glow of his circuit lighting the wet tunnel walls. He thought about Morty, about Beth, about the countless worlds he'd built just to avoid feeling anything. He wondered if they'd even noticed he was gone. The Rat King shifted in its sleep, letting out a soft squeak. Rick smiled. "Yeah, I know. Feelings are gross." He looked up at the ceiling, water dripping from old pipes, echoing like distant rain. "Guess we're not so different," he whispered. "You rule your chaos. I used to rule mine." He paused. Then, in a voice softer than the dripping, he added, "But maybe chaos doesn't need a king." For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. Not to himself, not to the universe, not even to the rats. He just sat there, a silent observer in a kingdom of creatures who had never heard his name and never would. And somehow, that anonymity felt like peace. When the dawn light filtered faintly through a broken drain, Rick stirred. He glanced at the Rat King, who was already awake, watching him. "Lesson learned?" Rick muttered. "Respect the kingdom, even if it's made of trash." He started gathering his tools, preparing to move again. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was escaping. He was learning, crawling forward not to conquer, but to understand. As he climbed deeper into the tunnel, the rats followed for a while, squeaking softly like a farewell. And when he finally turned the corner, their tiny sounds echoed through the dark like a prayer made of rust and empathy. Rick didn't look back. He didn't need to. The Rat King's lesson was already written inside him. That sometimes, survival isn't about brilliance, it's about connection. There was a night when the tunnels went completely dark. No trickle of water, no glint of light from the street grates above, just silence, the kind that swallows thoughts whole. Rick had stopped counting time down here. Days and nights blended like watercolors, bleeding into each other. His tiny mechanical limbs ached from effort, and the rust beneath him was slick with the slow breath of the city above. He didn't mind the quiet anymore. But tonight, something inside him felt heavier, like the dark wasn't outside him, but within. He was a genius surrounded by decay, a god reduced to crawling, and yet a faint ache whispered that maybe this was exactly what he needed to be. He lay still for a long time, the chill of the stone pressing against the glass of his body. A single droplet fell from the ceiling, splashing across his surface, and for a second it looked like a tear. Rick scoffed. Great, even the sewer's getting sentimental now. But even sarcasm sounded tired, so he decided to build something. Not for survival this time, not for escape, just because he wanted to see something beautiful again. He rummaged through the scraps he'd gathered, Bits of copper wire, a piece of broken glass, a flickering battery cell he'd stolen from a discarded rat trap. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make light. With steady, deliberate movements, Rick soldered, twisted, and connected. Each spark illuminated his surroundings for a second, like tiny fireworks in the underworld. He worked without speaking, without cursing, without rushing. When the final wire clicked into place, he hesitated. There it was, a palm-sized orb glowing faintly through cracked glass. Its light was weak, trembling like the first breath of dawn, but it was warm. Rick set it on the damp ground and leaned back. The reflection of the orb shimmered on the slick walls, turning the sewer into something that almost resembled a cathedral. He stared at it, unblinking. Not bad, he muttered softly. For a pickle. The light flickered. He thought it might die, but it steadied itself as if refusing to give in. And somehow that made Rick smile. He called it the lantern. Not because he needed to name things. He'd built universes without names. But because it deserved one. It was the first thing he'd made in a long time that wasn't meant to serve him. It was just meant to exist. He remembered building his first portal gun. He'd been younger then, drunk on discovery and ego. Every invention had been a weapon, a challenge to the universe itself. But this little flickering thing in the dark, wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. The lantern's glow reached the Rat King's nest nearby. Tiny eyes blinked awake, watching in silent wonder. A few rats approached cautiously, sniffing at the light but never daring to touch it. Rick chuckled. Yeah, I get it. I don't trust it either. The air felt softer now, almost dreamlike. The ripples of light danced across the puddles, casting constellations on the ceiling, like stars trapped underground. Rick's mind drifted to old memories. Not of wars or inventions, but of quieter things. A camping trip with Beth when she was small. She'd been afraid of the dark, so he'd built her a floating nightlight from spare circuits. She'd called it the star in a jar. He remembered the way she'd smiled at it, the way her tiny fingers had reached out to hold it close. That smile had been worth more than 1,000 scientific breakthroughs. And yet, somehow, he'd forgotten it, until now. Rick reached out with one mechanical limb and gently nudged the lantern closer to him. The warmth seeped through the glass, faint but comforting. He whispered, not to anyone, not even to himself. It's not much, but it's light. The words lingered like a confession. He thought about what light meant. To most, it was just photons, energy moving through space. But to him, tonight, it was something else. Light was the act of remembering what warmth felt like, even in the coldest place imaginable. He looked around the tunnels, all the wires, the pipes, the dripping walls. He imagined that somewhere above, people were sitting under lamps, unaware of the glowing orb that now breathed in the sewers beneath them. He wondered if Morty was asleep, if Beth was looking out her window, still worrying. He wondered if anyone would ever know that even here, in filth and silence, he'd made something beautiful. The lantern pulsed softly as if listening to his thoughts. For a brief moment, Rick imagined it had a heartbeat, not mechanical, but alive. He spoke to it quietly.
Don't burn out, all right? You're all I got down here.
The light flickered in response. He smiled again, small and sad. Yeah, figures. Time moved differently in the dark. Hours could have passed, or maybe only minutes. But something gentle happened in that stillness. Rick began to hum. Not a song, not really. Just a low tune. Something he might have sung to himself when he was younger, before the universe started listening. The rats listened too, and for a strange, suspended moment, the entire sewer felt alive. The lantern glowed a little brighter. Rick tilted his head back, staring at the faint, wet ceiling. Maybe I don't hate it here, he whispered. Maybe it's quiet enough to think. He thought of all the noise he'd left behind, the inventions, the endless escapes, the voices in his head that sounded like equations instead of feelings. Here, there was none of that. Just breath, just light, just peace. And for the first time in a long, long while, Rick didn't want to go anywhere. He just wanted to rest beside the small thing he'd made. The soft, trembling proof that even in decay there could still be wonder. He closed his eyes. The lantern kept burning, steady, patient, alive. In the dream that followed, Rick was no longer a pickle, no longer a man. He was simply light, drifting through the darkness, unbound, quiet, whole. And when the drip of water finally woke him, he found the lantern still glowing, still alive, still remembering. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Guess that makes two of us." The rats began to stir, and the sewer's quiet breath resumed. But Rick stayed still, watching the reflection of the light dance across the puddles. He didn't need equations to understand what it meant. It was a reminder that no matter how deep the dark, the smallest light still mattered. The tunnels had fallen quiet again, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that waits, listens, and remembers. Rick lay near his tiny lantern, the glow painting slow ripples of gold against the wet walls. The faint hum of its filament filled the air like a heartbeat, small, steady, fragile. He stared at it for a long time. It didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't judge, and yet, somehow, it reminded him of her. Wong, he hadn't thought of her voice in a while, not since the day he'd laughed through her sentences, interrupted her mid-thought, and escaped through sarcasm instead of truth. But here, in this endless sewer, with only rats, rust, and quiet, her words returned to him like an echo looping in gentle rhythm. You keep running from pain, Rick, but maybe pain is where you live. He remembered how he'd scoffed back then. He'd joked about therapy being emotional plumbing. Now he understood the irony. Here he was, literally crawling through pipes, and for the first time, letting himself leak a little. He chuckled under his breath. Well played, Wong. The sound bounced down the tunnel and came back softer, like someone laughing with him instead of at him. Rick sat still listening. No buzzing machines, no portals humming, just silence, wide, unbroken, and strangely comforting. He didn't realize how afraid he'd been of it. In the lab, he filled silence with invention. In his mind, he filled it with theories, equations, voices. But here, silence was no longer empty. It was full of space, of memory, of things left unsaid. He thought about Beth, the way she'd used to stare at him, trying to find love somewhere between the sarcasm and genius. He'd always assumed she'd inherited his sharpness, his logic. But maybe she'd inherited his loneliness too. He whispered into the dark, "You okay, kid?" He wasn't sure who he meant, Beth, Morty, or himself. The lantern flickered gently as if answering. He imagined Dr. Wong sitting across from him again, calm still, pen resting on her lap. He imagined her looking at him, not with judgment, but with the same curiosity he once reserved for new worlds. "Tell me, Rick," her memory said softly, "what would happen if you stopped trying to be right?" He blinked slowly. The question sank like a stone in water. If he stopped being right, if he stopped fighting, if he simply existed, he wasn't sure who he'd be then. For years he'd built universes just to avoid sitting still. Every invention was a wall. Every adventure was an escape route. And yet even here, turned into a pickle alone in the dark, he could feel the weight of all that running. It wasn't the universe chasing him, it was himself. The lantern's glow shimmered on the glass surface of his body. He could see his reflection distorted in it. Not the genius scientist, not the cosmic outlaw, just a tired man who'd run out of clever ways to hide. He murmured, maybe pain's not a punishment, maybe it's a teacher. The words came out uneven, almost like he didn't believe them. But they stayed. Rick watched as one of the smaller rats crawled near, sniffing the air, cautious but curious. It stopped beside the lantern and curled up next to it. Within moments, the rat fell asleep. Rick stared. That small, living thing had no science, no answers, no control, yet it trusted the light enough to rest beside it. That was something he'd forgotten how to do. Rest. He hadn't really rested in years. Even his sleep was mechanical, like charging batteries instead of dreaming. Now, for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to stop inventing for a while, to just be. He let the thought sit there, unfixed, unsolved, and that somehow was progress. Dr. Wong's voice returned again, calm and rhythmic, almost blending with the drip of water above. "You can't control connection, Rick. You can only allow it." He breathed, slow, steady. That was new too. He'd spent so long controlling, fixing, shaping. Now, here he was, doing nothing but listening. And in that stillness, something inside him, something small and long neglected, began to unclench. He remembered how Morty had looked at him the last time they'd argued. That mixture of admiration and exhaustion, the silent plea of someone who didn't want answers, just presence. Rick swallowed. "Sorry, kid," he whispered to no one. "Didn't mean to make you grow up so fast." His voice broke halfway through. The lantern flickered again, brighter this time as if absorbing his words. The light reflected across the walls, dancing like slow-moving constellations. Rick watched them until his mind softened. The patterns almost looked familiar, like old star charts he once drew for fun. He smiled faintly. Wes, even the universe doodles when it's bored. He tilted his head and listened to the faint hum of the lantern. Its rhythm almost matched his heartbeat. Or maybe his heartbeat was matching it. He couldn't tell anymore. A soft drizzle began above, rain filtering down through cracks in the street, tapping the sewer in small, melodic rhythms. For the first time, Rick didn't analyze the sound. He just listened. The rain sounded like music. Like the kind of music you forget exists until it's the only thing you hear. Dr. Wong's imagined voice spoke one last time, fading, until it was barely a whisper. Sometimes healing doesn't look like progress. It looks like staying still long enough to feel what's real. Rick exhaled. The air left his body in a quiet sigh. He looked at the lantern, at the sleeping rat, at the dim corridor stretching endlessly both ways. For once he didn't need a portal. He was exactly where he needed to be. No science. No escape. Just silence. And maybe, just maybe, a little peace. He leaned back against the wall, the soft glow warming his glass surface. His eyes fluttered closed not from exhaustion, but from a deep, overdue calm. He whispered one last thing before the dark took him. Maybe silence isn't empty after all. The lantern pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and then settled into a steady glow, keeping watch while Rick drifted into the first real rest he'd had in years. The tunnel was colder that morning, if it could even be called morning. No sunlight reached this deep, but Rick felt something shift. Maybe it was the faint hum of life above, the drip of water slowing, or just the heaviness in his chest beginning to lift. He opened his eyes. The lantern still glowed beside him, dim but steady, like a loyal thought that refused to fade. Around it, the small family of rats had vanished, leaving only tiny prints in the damp earth. Rick stared at those tracks for a while. They weren't random. They formed a trail, upward, toward the slant where the tunnel narrowed into shadow. He smiled faintly. "Wes, I'm not the only one looking for daylight." His voice echoed and died softly in the air. For a long time, he didn't move. He just watched the flickering light play across the curved walls, thinking about how strange it was to start again from the ground, to learn patience, to listen, to crawl. But something inside him whispered it's time. Rick gathered the few bits of metal he'd scavenged, tiny shards, broken screws, and old wire stripped of insulation. With those, he built a crude harness around his glass body, more for comfort than function. A pickle with a purpose, a joke maybe. But even jokes can be armor. He looked at the wall before him, steep, slick, uncertain. It reminded him of his life. And then, with a quiet sigh, he began to climb. His contraption squeaked and clicked, clumsy but determined. The metal scratched stone droplets ran down his face like sweat. Each inch upward felt earned, not by genius, not by technology, but by will. As he moved, he thought about the last time he climbed something. It wasn't a wall or a mountain. It was ambition. Every invention, every adventure, every escape had been a step higher. But the higher he climbed, the smaller everyone else became. Now alone in this narrow pipe, the climb wasn't about height anymore. It was about returning. Returning to what? He didn't know. Maybe to himself. Maybe to the people he'd hurt trying to stay untouchable. He paused halfway, catching his breath. The lantern's light glimmered below him, now small as a star. He realized he'd left it behind. A pang of sadness passed through him. That soft guilt of moving on from something that once kept you safe. But maybe that was what growth looked like, saying thank you to the light before you climb out of its reach. "Don't worry," he murmured downward. "I'll build another." His voice trembled, not from exhaustion, but from tenderness. Above, the sound of dripping water turned rhythmic, like footsteps in the distance. He imagined Morty out there somewhere, pacing the garage, wondering if he was okay. He smiled again faintly. "You worry too much, kid." But he knew it wasn't true. Morty's worry was the thread that tethered him to something real. Without that worry, Rick would have floated away long ago, into intellect, into nihilism, into the void of, does it even matter? It mattered. He was starting to see that now. The climb grew steeper. Rick's little harness scraped rock, pieces broke loose and fell into the dark below. The sound of metal on stone echoed like a slow heartbeat. He stopped to rest again and looked up. A faint light shimmered far above. Not sunlight, not yet, but the suggestion of it. He tilted his head, listening to the faint rumble of the world beyond cars, footsteps, life. He'd been away from it too long. Somewhere in that sound was laughter. Maybe imagined, maybe real. Morty's laughter, bright and uncertain. He could almost see the boy's messy hair, the way his hands fidgeted when nervous. He could hear his voice saying, "Come on, Rick. You can't just stay a pickle forever, right?" Rick chuckled softly. "Watch me." The laughter echoed back down to him, bouncing off the walls like ghosts of memories. Each echo felt warmer than the last. He kept climbing. At one point his grip slipped and for a heartbeat he dangled, suspended between darkness and light. In the past, that would have terrified him. But now something else happened. He laughed, genuinely, quietly, at the absurdity of it all. Fell from grace, fell from sanity, fell into a sewer, he muttered. And still climbing, the words sounded like poetry, maybe they were. He reached a narrow ledge where the tunnel widened again. There, lodged in a crack, he found an old bottle, half filled with rainwater and something glowing faintly inside. Curiosity stirred. He popped it open, and the faintest trace of light drifted out, like memory escaping. Inside the bottle was a fragment of a recording, long decayed, looping endlessly. "Hey, Dad, dinner's ready if you're not too busy saving the multiverse." Beth's voice. Young, bright, unbroken. The sound hit him like a wave. He'd forgotten that tone. The one before disappointment hardened it. The one before she learned to stop asking. He whispered, "Sorry, kiddo." The words vanished into the damp air. He sealed the bottle again gently. "You can rest now." Then he placed it back into the wall, like leaving a message for whoever came next. The climb continued. Every scrape, every pull, every small movement upward carried more weight than any portal jump ever had. There was no shortcut, no code, no machine, just him. And maybe that was the point. He began humming, low, tuneless, but steady. The sound echoed softly, and for a strange moment, it felt like he was harmonizing with himself. The tunnel's walls grew warmer, lighter. The faint glow above widened. He could smell the faint metallic tang of rain, the sweetness of air that hadn't been filtered through concrete. He was close. And then, with one last push, Rick pulled himself through the narrow mouth of the tunnel and out into the open. The world above was muted and grey. Clouds hung low. Rain fell in soft threads, but to him it was blindingly beautiful. He lay there on the pavement, water sliding over his glass surface, watching drops form little ripples around him. For a long time he didn't move. He just stared at the sky, the same sky he used to fly through without noticing. He whispered, "Ha, still here." The rain answered by pattering gently against the road, the rhythm syncing to the slow beat of his heart. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled like a lullaby. Rick smiled, not the crooked smirk of arrogance, but the quiet smile of someone who finally understood that escape wasn't about running. It was about returning. He looked at his reflection in a puddle, warped, imperfect, but real. Then he closed his eyes, feeling the cool rain soak into the cracks of his shell, and let himself breathe. He didn't know what would come next. He just knew he wasn't trapped anymore. The night was quiet in the Smith household, too quiet for Morty's restless mind. Rain whispered against the roof, steady and slow, like someone tapping gently to remind him he wasn't alone. He lay in bed, eyes half open, staring at the ceiling fan turning in lazy circles. Each rotation seemed to draw him deeper into a strange calm, the kind that only comes before something heavy. Sleep tugged at him like a tide, and soon the edges of the room began to dissolve. The faint hum of the house faded into the distance, and then he was somewhere else. The world around him glowed faintly, blue, liquid, infinite. He stood barefoot in shallow water that mirrored the stars above. Every ripple shimmered like glass. "Rick," his voice echoed softly. No answer, only the sound of distant waves and a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat underwater. He took a step forward, the reflection of his face bending and reshaping beneath his feet. The stars above seemed to shift with him, rearranging themselves into the shape of a jar. Tall, transparent, floating in the distance. Inside it something moved. Morty's breath caught. He walked closer, each step heavier than the last. The water deepened, the stars flickering dimmer. And there he was, Rick, suspended in brine, still as sleep. His face was calm, his hair floating gently like pale seaweed. No gadgets, no flask, no portal gun. Just Rick, unarmed and unguarded. "Rick," Morty whispered again. The jar glowed softly, responding like a living thing. A faint ripple of light traveled through the water. Then, faintly, the voice came. "Don't fix me, Morty. Just remember me when I'm still." Morty froze. The voice wasn't loud, it wasn't even sad. It was gentle, almost peaceful, like a tired confession. He pressed a hand to the glass. The surface was warm, not cold. Inside, Rick's eyes fluttered open, not wide, not sharp, but soft and human. "Rick, you're okay, right?" Rick's expression barely changed, but something in his gaze spoke volumes. It was the look of someone who had finally stopped fighting, not out of defeat, but acceptance. Morty felt a sting in his chest. He'd always seen Rick as invincible, a storm in a lab coat, a god with hangovers. But now, seeing him like this, floating between light and silence, it broke something gentle inside him. He whispered again, "I don't know what to do if you're not, you." Rick's mouth curved slightly. Maybe it was a smile, maybe just the reflection of stars bending across the glass. Then the jar began to rise, slowly, soundlessly toward the sky. "Wait, don't go," Morty cried, reaching upward. His voice cracked, echoing through the endless blue. The water surged around him, waves spiraling outward like breath. The jar ascended higher, the reflection of Rick's face fading into starlight. Morty tried to follow, but the water thickened, pulling him down. His feet sank. His arms grew heavy. "Rick," for a moment, the jar paused in midair, and Rick's voice echoed again, softer this time, almost like wind. "I'm not gone, Morty, just quieter." Then everything stilled. The jar burst into thousands of glowing fragments, scattering across the night sky. Each fragment became a star, a constellation of memory. Morty fell to his knees, hands sinking into the cold reflection. He looked up, watching the light settle into the shape of a familiar figure. A silhouette holding a flask, looking upward, infinite and small at once. And then the water went still again. He was alone. When Morty woke, dawn had just begun to break. Light filtered through the blinds in thin golden ribbons. The rain had stopped. Everything smelled clean, that strange, comforting scent after a storm. He blinked, disoriented, the dream clinging to him like fog. For a moment he swore he could still feel the warmth of that jar under his hand. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood settling. Summer's door was still closed. Beth had probably left early for work. Morty's gaze drifted to the window. Droplets clung to the glass, refracting the sunlight into tiny prisms. They looked like stars. He whispered to himself, just quieter. The words felt heavy yet comforting. As he got up, something caught his eye. On his desk, beside a crumpled stack of homework, sat a small glass jar. Empty, ordinary. Except for one thing inside, faint condensation shimmered, catching the light in soft, shifting patterns, like ripples of brine. Morty stared at it for a long moment. Then, without really thinking, he unscrewed the lid and whispered, "Hey Rick, wherever you are, hope you're not making too much of a mess." He laughed softly, shaking his head. It wasn't a sad laugh, just real. Then he placed the jar back on the desk and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he hesitated. Something told him to look back, just once. The sunlight hit the jar perfectly for half a second, and in that flicker Morty thought he saw a reflection, faint but unmistakable. A man's smirk, a familiar glint in the eye, and then it was gone. He smiled. Maybe it was imagination, maybe not. But for the first time in days, Morty didn't feel afraid. He walked downstairs, the floor creaking softly beneath his feet. The world felt heavier, yet strangely lighter, like the air after a confession. As he poured himself a bowl of cereal, he thought about all the adventures, all the chaos, all the screaming and laughter and explosions. But in the quiet of that morning, what stayed with him wasn't the noise. It was the stillness. The version of Rick that didn't need to fix, or flee, or prove. The version that just was. He didn't know if Rick would ever come back. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe what mattered was that, somewhere in the deep quiet of the universe, Rick had finally found a place where even he could rest, not as a scientist, not as a god, but as himself. And Morty had learned how to dream of him, not as a hero, but as a human being. The afternoon sunlight poured gently through the kitchen window, painting everything in honey-colored warmth. Beth stood at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug that had already been washed twice. The water ran endlessly, clear and steady, like time she couldn't pause. She wasn't really cleaning. She was thinking. The kind of thinking that loops in silence, where every sound in the house becomes a memory. The sound of Morty's quiet footsteps upstairs. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint drip from the faucet that never quite stopped. Everything ordinary, and yet, since Rick had disappeared, it all carried a strange, delicate weight. Beth exhaled slowly, shutting off the water. For a long moment, she stared at her reflection in the window, the way the light caught her eyes, the faint lines around them. She looked older than she remembered. Behind her, the counter was cluttered with remnants of her father's world. A half-disassembled tool, a stack of old schematics, a forgotten flask. She hadn't touched them, not because she was afraid, but because somehow it felt wrong to disturb them. It was as if the silence had become sacred. Later that afternoon, she found herself drawn to the garage, the place that still smelled faintly of oil ozone and something metallic she could never quite name. The air was still. The machines were silent, covered in a thin film of dust. The old couch, stained with burns and coffee rings, sat beneath a shelf of half-empty vials, and on the far wall, a photo. It was framed crookedly, the edges of the glass cracked. A younger Beth, missing a front tooth, sat on Rick's shoulders, pointing towards something off camera. He was smiling. Not the smug grin she remembered, not the sarcastic tilt, but a real smile, unaware, uncalculated. She reached out and touched the edge of the frame, her thumb tracing the faded corner. "Why do you always have to disappear, huh?" she whispered. The garage didn't answer. She closed her eyes, remembering the days when her father's absences were routine. The sudden vanishing, the impossible explanations. "Don't wait up, Beth. Daddy's got science to do." She used to wait anyway. Every night, she'd fall asleep by the window, counting the stars and convincing herself that one of them blinked back. A sudden noise broke her thought, the faint clink of glass. Beth turned. On the workbench, one of Rick's jars had rolled slightly, catching a beam of sunlight. Inside, something shimmered, faint greenish light, soft and pulsing, almost alive. She walked over slowly, curiosity and dread folding into one. When she lifted it, the warmth of the glass startled her. It wasn't glowing from anything mechanical. It was just warm, the same kind of warmth a person leaves on a chair after standing. Beth smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You really don't know how to stay gone, do you?" She set the jar back down gently, The glow faded, but she didn't mind. It was enough to have felt it once. That night, when the house had gone quiet again, Beth sat by the old lamp in the living room. Its light was dim and golden. The same hue as late summer evenings from her childhood. She had a photo album in her lap, one she hadn't opened in years. Flipping through it, she saw moments she'd forgotten: birthday cakes, messy hair, her mother's faint smile, Rick in the background pretending not to care but always there. In one picture, she was about 5, holding a wooden horse he'd built for her. The paint was uneven, one wheel crooked. She'd loved it anyway. He'd told her once, "Perfection's overrated, kiddo. The fun's in the mess." At the time, she'd rolled her eyes. Now, decades later, she finally understood. Every good thing in their family had been messy, broken, glued, uneven, but still real. She turned another page. Near the back, tucked between pages, something small slipped out. A folded note, old and yellowed at the edges. It was written in Rick's unmistakable scrawl, chaotic, uneven, half in uppercase, half not. "To Beth, if you're reading this, I probably messed something up again. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe this is just one of those times when words are easier than being there. I know I wasn't good at the whole dad thing. I was good at running, at hiding behind big words, but I always watched you. Every time you built something, fixed something, tried something. You were the one thing I didn't screw up completely. Don't let the silence make you think I don't care. It's the only way I ever knew how to love." Quietly, Beth's breath trembled. For a long while she couldn't move. She could almost hear his voice as she read it again, softer this time, letting the words fall like rain against her chest. Her father, brilliant, impossible, broken, had finally said the one thing she never thought he would. She pressed the note against her chest, eyes closing. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the leaves against the window. The night smelled faintly of earth and storm, the kind of scent that always reminded her of him. She smiled, a real one this time. Quietly, she whispered, echoing his words. The lamp flickered once, as if in response. Later, she walked out to the porch. The sky was vast and clear, the stars scattered like grains of salt across black silk. She leaned against the railing, her breath misting in the cool air. Somewhere deep in that endless stretch, her father was out there. In body or in memory, she didn't know. Maybe both. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to find him. Maybe this was what letting go felt like, not forgetting, but forgiving. She looked up, finding one star brighter than the rest. It pulsed softly, the same hue as the light from the jar. Beth smiled faintly. "You can rest now, Dad." A breeze moved gently through her hair, like an unseen hand passing by. And for a brief moment she thought she heard his voice, half a whisper carried through the night. "Good job, kiddo." She laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that comes with tears and peace all at once. The world around her was still, soft and infinite. Somewhere, far beyond her sight, maybe Rick was still floating, not lost this time, just free. Morning came like a sigh after a long storm. The light above the sewer was pale and silver, sliding through cracks in the world like a memory trying to return. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and rust, the perfume of forgotten places. Rick's small, brined body rested near a trickle of water that murmured over the concrete. He didn't move at first. For a while, he simply listened, to the slow drip, to the faint scurrying of rats, to the whisper of air finding its way down through the grates above. He had forgotten what morning sounded like. In this strange stillness, he realized how long he had been running, not through portals or galaxies, but within himself. Every invention, every escape, every clever line of code had been another way of avoiding this silence. And now silence was all there was. A drop of water landed on his side. It trailed downward like a tear across glass. The sensation was startling, not painful, not pleasant, just real. He blinked, or would have if he still had eyelids. "Guess this is what enlightenment looks like," he muttered to no one, his voice echoing faintly inside the tiny chamber of his mind. He didn't know if anyone could hear him. Maybe no one needed to. The rats were gone now. The small metal contraption he had built, the glowing orb of light he had made from fragments and will, had long dimmed. But in that fading glow something in him had changed. He had always believed he was the one who shaped worlds, who controlled the rules, who made the impossible happen. But down here, as a pickle in the dark, he had learned that the universe didn't need him to move. It just existed. And in some gentle, unbearable way, so did he. The hum of the world above felt like music now, a reminder that there was more to existence than equations and brilliance. He took a long, imaginary breath, then another, and somewhere deep inside the small green shell that held him, Rick Sanchez decided it was time to move. Not to escape, not to prove anything, but simply to rise. The climb was slow. Piece by piece, inch by inch, he used the remnants of his tiny machine, hooks, coils, scraps, to pull himself upward along the damp wall. Each sound was soft, deliberate, almost reverent. There was no rush, no frenzy, no spark of genius lighting his way. Just gravity and persistence, two forces that had always quietly governed everything, even him. For the first time, he respected them. He wasn't escaping anymore. He was returning to something deeper than home, to the surface, to light. It was strange how the effort felt human again. Every scrape of metal, every strained movement was a reminder that progress didn't need to be spectacular. Sometimes it just meant not giving up. He paused halfway up, looking down into the dark water below. It shimmered faintly, reflecting the last flicker of his tiny lamp. It looked almost like a star. He smiled, the kind of small, private smile that never reaches the lips but fills the heart instead. "Guess I'm not as far from the stars as I thought." When he finally reached the opening, sunlight struck him with a warmth so sudden it felt like a memory. The world above was quiet. A stretch of cracked pavement, tall grass pushing through the edges, the faint rustle of wind through trees. Rick rested there for a while, half in shadow, half in light. The sky wasn't as he remembered it. It was softer, the blue less harsh, the clouds slower, like they too had learned patience. Somewhere in the distance he heard laughter. A child's voice carried by the wind. For a moment he imagined it was Morty. He chuckled weakly. "Yeah, kid, you'd love this one." The breeze carried his words away. He looked down at himself, still a pickle, still absurd, and yet he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. No formulas, no infinite universes, no need to prove he was the smartest man alive, just sunlight and breath, and the sound of the world turning without him needing to fix it. He began to roll forward slowly, letting the earth carry him. The ground was uneven, textured with small stones and dirt, and every little bump was a reminder that he existed physically, not as a mind floating above reality, but as something inside it. For a man who had once rewritten physics, the feeling of being small was oddly comforting. At the edge of the hill he stopped. Below, a wide field stretched out, patches of wildflowers bending under the wind, the faint glint of water from a small pond catching the sun. It was beautiful. He thought of Beth, of Morty, of summer. He thought of the garage, the smell of burnt circuits and coffee. The sound of Morty laughing when he didn't mean to. Beth's quiet, careful voice when she tried not to cry. They were his gravity. The quiet forces pulling him back toward the surface every time he drifted too far. The clouds above began to drift apart, revealing a deeper, brighter sky. For the first time, Rick didn't think about where he'd been or what he'd lost. He just let the light hit him, soaking through his shell, into the strange, fragile spark that was his consciousness. It felt like forgiveness, not from anyone else, from himself. He whispered softly, maybe this is what it's supposed to feel like." The wind responded with a low hum, brushing through the grass, moving gently across his side like a lullaby. He could almost hear his daughter's laughter again, echoing from a memory too far to grasp. He closed his imaginary eyes. For a long time, he simply lay there, not asleep, not awake, existing in that quiet space between both. And for once that was enough. As the day stretched toward evening, the sun sank lower, turning gold against the horizon. The sky deepened into a soft violet haze. Rick watched as the world dimmed, slow, graceful, unhurried. He whispered to the fading light, "Wes, you waited long enough for me." And maybe, just maybe, the light answered back, in the way only silence can. He smiled one last time before the darkness came, not as an ending, but as a gentle return to stillness. Somewhere beyond thought he was ready, to rise again, to return home. Evening folded itself across the world like a velvet curtain. The last light of day shimmered on the pond below the hill where Rick rested, soft gold melting into deep blue, rippling gently with the rhythm of the wind. He lay at the water's edge now, still and silent. From a distance he was just another piece of debris washed up by time, a glint of green among the reeds. But up close, behind that absurd briny shell, something was stirring again. It wasn't genius. It wasn't guilt. It was something older, simpler, curiosity. For the first time in what felt like eternity, Rick looked down at his reflection. The surface of the pond trembled slightly, as if nervous under his gaze. Ripples spread outward from his form, breaking and reforming his face into infinite, distorted versions of himself. 1,000 Ricks stared back, each one warped, each one wrong, each one whispering a different memory. The Rick who left his family, the Rick who laughed too loudly at destruction, the Rick who drowned himself in alcohol to forget what he'd built, the Rick who thought love was weakness, and beneath all those faces, the Rick who simply wanted to stop running. He stared, motionless. The pond grew still again, and for the first time, the reflection looking back wasn't distorted. It was clear, a small green figure, ridiculous and alone, staring at the universe through tired, unblinking eyes. Rick Sanchez, the smartest man alive, the loneliest too. The wind carried the faint sound of water insects skimming across the pond's surface. Each tiny ripple made the reflection shimmer, alive, fragile, temporary. He thought about how he used to look into mirrors back in his garage, his face framed by blue light and chemical fumes. He'd always avoided eye contact with himself. He preferred to stare past the reflection, focusing instead on the inventions behind him. Mirrors to him were useless until now, because now, in the quiet hum of this forgotten evening, there was no machine to hide behind, no joke, no noise, just the truth reflected in still water. He whispered softly, "So this is me, huh?" The pond didn't answer. It didn't need to. He felt something crack inside. Not a sound, not a thought, just a quiet shift. The kind that comes when you finally accept that the storm has passed, and all that's left is the cleanup. He remembered Morty's eyes when he told him he was fine. He remembered Beth's silence when she pretended to believe it. He remembered every time he chose science over solace, logic over love. Each memory surfaced like an air bubble in dark water, popping gently, leaving only rings of regret behind. But regret wasn't the enemy anymore. It was proof. Proof that there had been meaning once, that he had cared, that he had hurt, that he was still capable of both. He looked at his reflection again and spoke to it as though it were a stranger. "I thought I could outsmart the pain, build something smarter than grief, but all I did was build walls." The reflection rippled again, breaking apart. The fragments shimmered in the fading light like scattered glass. Rick took a long, imaginary breath. Maybe walls were the problem all along. He watched as a small fish surfaced near his side, its scales catching the light. It circled him curiously, unafraid, as if sensing no threat from this odd intruder. The sight made him laugh, softly, almost tenderly. "Gus, you're smarter than most species." "Huh." The fish darted away, vanishing beneath the pond's mirror like surface. Rick stared after it for a while. Then, without thinking, he rolled slightly forward until the tip of his pickle body touched the water. The ripples spread outward, carrying pieces of the sky along with them. His reflection fractured again, but this time he didn't look away. He let it break. He let it reform. He let it exist, just as imperfect as he was. A voice drifted through his mind, faint but familiar, not real, not present, just memory. "Dad, you don't have to fix everything." Beth's voice. He could almost feel her hand on his shoulder again, small, warm, trembling. That long-ago moment before he disappeared into another portal, another excuse. He'd brushed her hand away then, not cruelly, just habitually, as if affection were an interruption to his calculations. Now, in the soft golden quiet of the pond side, he would have given anything to feel it again. He whispered into the night, "I'm sorry, kiddo." The words hung in the air, heavy and holy. Then they faded into the gentle rustle of reeds. Above him the sky began to deepen into indigo. The first stars blinked awake, shy and scattered. Rick watched them appear one by one, tiny pinholes in the fabric of existence. He'd mapped those stars once, conquered them, rewritten their physics, mocked their patterns. But now they felt like company, each one a silent witness, each one a version of himself across the multiverse, some brilliant, some broken, all trying to find meaning in the chaos. He chuckled faintly. "Hey, multiverse me's, hope one of you figured this crap out." His voice faded into the cool night. The stars didn't answer, but they seemed to shimmer a little brighter, as if listening. The reflection in the pond now was no longer just Rick's. It was a merging of everything. The sky above, the stars, the shadows of reeds, and his small, absurd form at the center. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel separate from it all. He felt part of it. The stars, the pond, the darkness, the laughter, the sorrow, it was all one vast, breathing organism, and he was just another pulse within it. He whispered quietly, "Guess I'm not outside the equation anymore." And somehow that thought didn't hurt. It felt right. The wind shifted again, carrying the cool scent of night toward him. The pond rippled once more, distorting his reflection into something unrecognizable. Not Rick, not a pickle, not even a man, just movement. Just being. And maybe that was the truest reflection of all. He let the moment linger, suspended between thought and stillness. Then, with slow, deliberate effort, he began to move away from the pond. The journey wasn't over. He could feel that now. There was still something waiting beyond this quiet awakening. A reckoning. A return. But for now he carried the reflection with him. The image of himself, finally seen clearly in the still water of a forgotten world. Not as a genius. Not as a monster, just as Rick. A man made of mistakes and moments, still learning how to breathe. The morning came slow, soft and pale, like light filtered through memory. Dew clung to every blade of grass, shimmering faintly in the half-sunrise. The world was quiet, and for once it stayed that way. Morty walked carefully through the field, each step sinking into damp soil. His breath came out in slow clouds. He'd been searching all night, ever since the dream. The one where Rick's voice came not from a portal, not from a lab, but from a whisper under starlight. The dream hadn't told him where, but it had told him how to look. Not with panic, not with fear, with stillness. And so Morty followed the silence. For miles he wandered. Past the broken fence near the Smith's property, through the crooked trees where he and Rick once hid from time police, across a small creek that gurgled like it knew secrets. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of something recently disturbed. Small trails of mud, faint scorch marks in the grass, the smell of ozone. He wasn't sure if he was tracking his grandfather or his own hope, but he couldn't stop. Rick was out there somewhere, not lost exactly, just waiting to be found. Morty pressed onward, his shoes soaked, his heart heavy. By the time he reached the pond, the sun had fully risen. Its reflection glowed across the surface like liquid gold. Birds chirped softly, oblivious to the story playing out below them. That's when Morty saw it, a faint green glint among the reeds. He froze. For a second, he thought it was a trick of light. Then the shape caught the sunlight again, dull, cracked, and unmistakably familiar.
Rick, not in human form, not yet.
Just a pickle? But somehow that made it worse. Morty approached slowly, his breath catching as he knelt beside the water. "Rick," he whispered, voice trembling. No answer, just the soft lapping of the pond against the mud. He reached down with both hands, gently lifting the small, rough shape from the ground. It was heavier than he expected, and cold, not just from the air but from absence. The glassy surface was dull now, faintly chipped along the edges. But the faint hum, the one he remembered from the lab, was still there, faint but alive. "Jeez, Rick," Morty murmured, his voice breaking a little. "You really did it, huh? You really went all the way this time." He held the pickle close, cradling it like something fragile, like a memory he was afraid to lose. The air felt thick with meaning, like the whole world had paused to listen. Morty sat down on the edge of the pond, legs dangling over the water. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. There was no clever speech, no scolding, no question about why. Because for once, Morty understood that why didn't matter. Rick hadn't done this to escape responsibility or mock therapy or prove he could outsmart death. Not this time. This time, it felt like Rick had done it because he didn't know what else to do. Because silence had become the only place he hadn't tried to run to. And somehow, Morty respected that. He turned the small body in his hands and looked closely at the faint metal joints Rick had welded to himself. Tiny scraps of mechanical adaptation that had kept him alive. Even now, the craftsmanship amazed him. Even in isolation, Rick had built something beautiful out of despair. Morty sighed and said softly, "You always think you gotta build your way out of stuff, huh? But maybe this time, maybe you were just trying to feel something that didn't hurt." A light breeze passed through the reeds. Somewhere far off, a bird took flight. Morty tilted his head, listening, not for a voice, but for a sign. And then faintly, almost imperceptibly, he heard it. A tiny vibration from the pickle's shell, a whisper, barely there. Morty's eyes widened. "Rick."
"Oh, geez, Rick, you're alive."
The voice crackled through the static of the built-in circuitry. Weak, distant, but undeniably him. "Didn't think you'd find me." Morty laughed nervously, tears stinging his eyes. "Didn't think you'd let me, Rick. You always disappear when it gets hard." There was a pause. Then faintly, almost too soft to hear. "Wasn't hiding this time." Morty's throat tightened. He didn't know how to respond. He just held the small form closer, as though his warmth could fill whatever void Rick had fallen into. For a long moment they sat there, just boy and pickle, sun and pond, silence and understanding. The scene felt absurd, even cosmic, like the universe had stopped trying to make sense and finally allowed itself to just be. Morty whispered, "You know, I used to think you didn't care about anyone. That you were just empty inside. But maybe you were just tired, huh?" Rick's hum flickered again. A faint, almost approving sound. "Tired's a word for it." Morty smiled sadly. "Well, rest now, okay? You don't gotta fix anything today." He placed the pickle gently in his jacket pocket, where it rested against his chest, close enough to hear his heartbeat. Rick didn't respond. But the hum steadied, sensing faintly with the rhythm. It was enough. As Morty stood up, the light shifted, and his reflection appeared beside Rick's in the pond below, two shapes, side by side. One small, one smaller, one alive, one almost. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. He whispered to their shared reflection, "I'll get you home, Rick. We'll fix you, but not like before. No more running. Okay?" The water shimmered as if nodding in agreement, and for a fleeting second, Morty thought he saw Rick's reflection blink, not in the water, not in reality, but somewhere deeper, in the place where connection lives. The walk home was long and quiet. The world seemed to cradle them gently. The trees swaying, the sky fading from gold to grey, the wind whispering through grass like an old lullaby. Morty didn't rush. He didn't call for help. He didn't look back. Because somehow he knew this part of the story wasn't about saving Rick, it was about finding him. And he had. By the time he reached the edge of the neighborhood, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. Streetlights flickered on, one by one, small pockets of warmth in a cooling world. Morty reached into his pocket and whispered, "Almost home, Rick." No reply came this time, but he didn't need one. The hum was there, steady and soft, like breathing. For the first time in a long while, Morty didn't feel afraid. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope. Not the loud, desperate kind, the quiet kind, the kind that sits beside sorrow and still chooses to stay. And as the last bit of daylight faded from the sky, Morty looked up and said softly, "Welcome back, Rick." The world didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because in his pocket, faint and steady, the hum of life continued, the smallest, truest sound of all. The house was quiet when Morty stepped inside. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. Even the clock in the hallway ticked softly, as if it didn't want to disturb the stillness. Beth was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, her hair messy from a long day at work. She didn't turn when Morty entered, not right away. She was staring at the sink, lost in some distant thought. Then she heard the door creak. "Morty." Her voice was tired but tender. Morty hesitated in the doorway, clutching his jacket close to his chest. He wasn't sure how to say it. He just looked at her, eyes red, face pale, and whispered, "Mum, I found him." Beth froze. For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she turned. "You found who?" Morty reached into his jacket and carefully pulled out the small green shape, still faintly humming in his hands. The light from the window caught the tiny cracks on Rick's surface. Beth's breath hitched. "Oh my God." "Yeah," Morty said softly. "Hey, he's okay, I think. Just tired." He didn't say what he'd seen out there. The still pond, the reflection, the quiet sadness that hung around Rick like a halo. He didn't need to. It was written all over his face. Beth walked closer, her footsteps slow, deliberate. She stopped at the edge of the counter, looking down at the thing that was once her father. For a moment, she didn't see a Pickle. She saw the man who built her a paper rocket when she was 5. The man who vanished for months at a time and came back with haunted eyes. The man who loved her in his own broken language. Beth's voice came out as a whisper. "You really did it this time, Dad." Morty placed Rick gently in the sink. The porcelain was cool against his hands. He turned the faucet just enough to let warm water run, a gentle stream soft as rain. Steam rose slowly, curling in the air like sleep. Beth stood beside him, watching in silence. Together, they held the small shape steady under the flow, as if bathing something sacred. Rick didn't move, not in any visible way. But the faint hum deepened, as though the warmth coaxed him back toward consciousness. Morty smiled faintly. "Feels nice, huh, Rick?" The water trickled down, clearing away dirt and grime, the residue of sewer water and time. Tiny bits of rust and debris slipped away into the drain. Beth dipped her fingers into the stream and gently brushed the side of Rick's shell. "You used to do this for me," she murmured. "When I fell asleep in the car and you didn't want to wake me up, you'd wash my hands and carry me to bed." Her words broke halfway through, caught between memory and ache. Morty said nothing. He just watched the water move, watched how it carried small flecks of green down the sink like falling stars. There was no science in this moment. No portal, no machine, no lab, just water, warm and simple, and 2 people who didn't know how to say "I forgive you," so they said it with care instead. Beth reached for a towel, one of those old, faded ones that still smelled faintly of detergent and summer air. She dabbed gently, drying the surface. Her hands trembled a little. Morty asked quietly, "Do you think he can hear us?" Beth paused. "I think he always could. He just didn't know how to answer." The hum softened. It wasn't mechanical anymore. It sounded almost like breathing. Beth tilted her head. "Morty, do you hear that?" He nodded.
Yeah.
The sound wasn't steady. It fluttered like an old heartbeat trying to remember its rhythm. But it was there, alive. Beth leaned over the sink and whispered, "Hey, Dad, you're home. You can rest now." She rested her hand on the edge of the counter. Morty saw her shoulders shake, not from fear, but from release. Years of anger, disappointment, and buried love finally breaking the surface. For once, she didn't fight the tears. Morty looked away, giving her space. He turned the faucet off and let the last of the water pool around Rick, reflecting the kitchen lights like tiny suns. The warmth spread through the room, quiet and golden. A small blinking light appeared on Rick's casing, uncertain but persistent. Morty gasped. "Mom, look." The hum grew louder, syncopated, rhythmic, then faint, garbled. A voice crackled through the speaker on Rick's modified shell. "Beth." Beth froze, eyes wide. "Dad, you always leave the tap running," Rick murmured weakly. Morty laughed through his tears. "Oh geez, Rick, you're back." Beth covered her mouth, half laughing, half sobbing. "You stubborn old man." Rick's voice glitched slightly, tone low but sincere. "Didn't want to go yet." Beth smiled softly, shaking her head. "You never do." They moved him gently onto a clean towel and carried him to the kitchen table, the same table where countless family arguments had taken place. But tonight, it felt different. The air was softer, the walls seemed to listen. Beth pulled out a small screwdriver set, one of Rick's own, and began to open the casing around the small speaker. She worked carefully, hands steady, as though touching something holy. Morty watched, quietly in awe. "You know what you're doing," Beth smiled faintly. "He taught me." A long time ago, as the final screw came loose, a faint pulse of blue light flickered beneath the surface, Rick's consciousness drive still intact. Beth's breath trembled. "He's in there." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Beth said softly, "Let's clean him up, Morty. Not because he deserves it, but because he's ours." Morty nodded. Together they wiped away the grime from the small device, polishing it until it glowed faintly in the dim kitchen light. Outside, rain began to fall again, gentle, rhythmic, familiar. It sounded like forgiveness. When they finished, Beth placed Rick back on the counter, now warm and shining. She turned off the lights except for the small lamp above the sink. The glow washed the room in amber. Rick's hum steadied once more, a soft, reassuring tone. Beth leaned against the counter and whispered, "Good night, Dad." Morty echoed softly, "Good night, Rick." The kitchen was silent again, but not empty. The kind of silence that means something is healing. In the other room, the rain tapped gently on the windows. The scent of warm water and faint metal lingered in the air. For the first time in a long time, the Smith house didn't feel like a battleground of emotions. It felt like a home, and somewhere in that warmth between water and light, Rick rested. Not fixed, not forgiven, but understood. Morning drifted in softly like a sigh that had been waiting all night. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving tiny pearls of water trembling on the kitchen window. Beth stood beside the table, hair undone, face pale but calm. She hadn't slept. Morty was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, one hand hanging limply over the edge. The hum from the counter had lulled him to sleep, the faint rhythm of Rick's dormant device pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Beth didn't move for a while. She just stood there, watching the faint blue glow through the transparent case of the machine that now held what remained of her father's mind. A soft, mechanical breath escaped it. A whisper, almost like a dream trying to return to the body it once belonged to. The first rays of dawn painted the floor in amber. Beth exhaled and whispered, "Okay, Dad, let's bring you home." She reached for Rick's tools, the ones he used to scatter everywhere, as if chaos itself was his method. Each instrument carried memory, a burn mark here, a bent screw there. He'd called it organized entropy. She'd called it being impossible. Now, with trembling hands, she laid them out carefully on the table. Order for once. She opened the small interface screen on the side of the device. Data strings flickered and glitched, forming symbols half recognizable, half nonsensical. Rick's mind rendered as equations of chaos and regret. "Still complicated," she murmured. "Even when you're quiet." Morty stirred awake at the sound of her voice. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and shuffled toward the table. Beth nodded softly. "He's close." Morty looked at the glowing drive. "He looks peaceful." Beth smiled faintly. "That's not a word I'd ever thought I'd use for him." They shared a small laugh, weary but real. Then, silence. Only the hum remained. Beth connected the neural stabilizer, the same one Rick had once used to clone his body during one of his backup contingency experiments. The memory made her shiver. "Mom," Morty said quietly, "are you sure you can do this?" Beth hesitated. "No." She pressed a small button anyway. The room filled with a low vibration. Blue light pulsed outward, washing across the counters and silverware, turning shadows into waves. Morty stepped back. Whoa! Tiny arcs of static danced between the metal parts. The glow intensified. Inside the casing, something moved. A pulse, a flicker, a rhythm struggling to find itself. Then came a voice. Beth. Her name cracked through the air like a memory. Beth gasped. Dade. Still hate mornings. Morty let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He's awake. The machine's hum deepened. The glow began to fade, condensing into a core of soft gold light, and then, slowly, a thin column of particles, tiny, glittering, began to rise upward, coalescing into a faint humanoid outline. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, almost reverent. Rick's voice emerged clearer now, though quieter than before. Guess that worked. Beth stared in disbelief as the faint holographic form stabilized. Rick's familiar outline, shoulders hunched, lab coat faintly rippling like mist. Die. He blinked, looking down at his own hands, translucent, trembling with energy. You used the old sink drive, huh? Kinda poetic. Thought I'd burned that thing. Beth's eyes shimmered. You didn't, you just forgot. Morty stepped forward, voice small. Rick, are you okay? Rick chuckled. Weakly, but real. Define okay, Morty. Existentially, I'm a ghost made of brine and bad decisions, but physically, I've been worse. Morty smiled through tears. You look different. Rick's gaze softened. Yeah, feels different too. Like less noise in the head. He looked around the kitchen. At Beth. Morty, the faint steam from the kettle Beth had left forgotten. Feels quiet. Beth swallowed hard. Do you want to come back fully? Rick hesitated. His expression flickered. Guilt, longing, fear. I don't know if I should. That answer hung in the air like mist. Beth frowned. What do you mean? Rick sighed, his holographic outline dimming slightly. Every time I come back, I hurt someone. You, Morty, everyone. Maybe it's time to stop. Morty shook his head. That's not true. Rick, you just don't stay long enough to fix things. Rick met his eyes. The same tired blue, but softer now. You sound like your mom. Morty smiled faintly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Beth walked closer, voice trembling. Dad, you don't get to disappear again. Not like this. If you want to change, do it here, with us. Rick looked down at the sink where his old form still rested. Just a shell now, water streaked and still warm. He whispered, you cleaned me. Beth nodded. Yeah, why? Because you're family. That word hit him harder than any equation ever had. He blinked as though the concept itself was too bright to process. Family, he repeated softly. Then, with a small, tired laugh, Gus, there's no formula for that. He looked at the stabilization panel one last time, fingers trembling in the light. All right, he murmured, let's finish this. Beth reached over and pressed the final activation key. Light flooded the room, not blinding but warm, gentle, alive. The air shimmered, rippling like sunlight through water. The hologram condensed, solidifying. When it faded, Rick stood there, breathing, blinking, real. He looked older somehow, though no time had passed. His lab coat was torn at the sleeve, his hair softer, his eyes not burning, but glowing faintly with something fragile, peace. Morty stared, stunned. Rick, you're back. Rick rubbed his temples. Yeah, Morty. Feels weird. Beth took a small step forward. Does it hurt? Rick smiled faintly. Everything hurts, always has, but right now it's quiet pain, manageable. For a moment, the three of them stood there, wrapped in silence and sunlight. No portals, no gadgets, no shouting, just breath. Rick leaned against the counter, staring at the warm sink where the water still glistened faintly. You know, he said softly, for a pickle, I made one hell of a comeback. Beth laughed, really laughed this time. A sound that filled the kitchen like dawn. Morty joined in, shaking his head. You're unbelievable, Rick. Rick smiled. Small, honest human. Yeah, Morty, but you still came looking for me. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The world smelled new, wet earth, light wind, the promise of another day. Rick stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the clouds move slowly apart. He whispered, almost to himself, guess therapy worked after all. Beth smiled faintly. You're going back? Rick shrugged. Maybe. Maybe I'll just listen this time. The light faded softly against the kitchen walls, and for the first time in a long, long while, Rick didn't feel like running. He just breathed. And in that breath, he found something he'd forgotten how to name, peace. The sky was grey again, not storming, just grey, calm and slow. Rick sat in the passenger seat of Beth's car, staring out the window as raindrops slid down like tiny comets. Every droplet seemed to race the others, only to vanish before reaching the edge of the glass. He smirked faintly. Entropy, he muttered. Even water obeys it. Beth said nothing. She was driving, hands tight around the steering wheel, jaw set. The silence between them wasn't angry. It was tender, almost cautious, as if both were afraid to break something fragile that had just begun to mend. Dad, she finally said, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. Rick glanced at her. Yeah, well, maybe I do. Beth looked at him briefly, surprised. You, voluntarily going to therapy? He shrugged. Don't make a big deal out of it. I just ran out of rats to talk to. Beth laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounds like healing. Dr. Wong's office was the same as before, neutral walls, soft yellow lighting, the faint smell of tea and disinfectant. The air felt thick with quiet. The soundproofed walls made it seem like the rest of the world had dissolved. No portal guns, no chaos, no noise. Rick stood at the door for a long moment before entering. His reflection in the glass caught his eye, tired, weathered, real. He almost turned away. Dr. Wong looked up from her desk. Rick. Her voice was calm, warm and slightly amused. It's been a while. Rick stepped in slowly, hands in the pockets of his coat. Yeah. Sorry. Got pickled for a bit. She smiled softly. I heard. He raised an eyebrow. You heard. Your daughter called ahead, she said. Said you've been through something. Rick exhaled through his nose, pulling the chair slightly before sitting. That's one way to put it. The silence between them settled, heavy but not uncomfortable. Rick fidgeted with a paperclip from the edge of the desk, bending it into a spiral. Dr. Wong waited. She always did. He hated that and loved it. Finally, he spoke. You ever wake up and feel like you've been running so long, you forgot what standing still even feels like? She tilted her head slightly. That's an interesting way to start. Are you saying you've stopped running? Rick gave a half smile. Temporarily. Can't promise it'll stick. That's okay, she said simply. He frowned. That's it? No lecture, she sipped her tea. You don't need one, you already gave yourself plenty. Rick chuckled dryly. Guess you're charging me to agree with me now. Not at all, she replied. I'm charging you to listen. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. You know what's funny? I thought if I ever got quiet, the universe would collapse. Turns out, it just keeps spinning. Doesn't even notice. Did that bother you? At first. Then it felt freeing. Dr. Wong nodded. That's often how humility feels. Like loss at first. Rick looked at her. You saying I'm humble now? I'm saying, she replied calmly, that you've experienced limitation and survived it. He huffed. Limitation's a polite word for failure. No, she said gently. It's the start of empathy. For the first time, Rick didn't roll his eyes. He just stared down at his hands, the same hands that had built universes, erased timelines, broken hearts. They trembled faintly now, not from fear but fatigue. I thought control was the only thing keeping me sane, he said. But when I lost it, when I couldn't even move, couldn't be, I started hearing things. Dr. Wong's gaze softened. What did you hear? Rick smiled faintly. Everything I'd been ignoring, the world. People, rats even. Hell, my own damn heartbeat. He paused, eyes distant. It was peaceful. Dr. Wong leaned forward slightly. You found peace in stillness. What did you do with it? Rick chuckled. Wested it, probably. She smiled. And yet you're here. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. Yeah, well, Morty wouldn't stop looking at me like I'd just come back from the dead. Didn't you? She asked softly. Rick froze for a second, then looked up. Maybe, he said. Maybe I did. A long silence filled the room. Not awkward, not empty, just space. Rick looked toward the rain-speckled window. You know what the weirdest part of all this is? What? When you're not running, you start to remember why you started in the first place. Dr. Wong nodded. And why did you? Rick smirked. Because the universe was boring and stupid. She didn't flinch. And now, he thought for a moment. Now I think maybe I was the boring and stupid one. Dr. Wong smiled, setting her tea down gently. That's a good realization. You've always sought meaning in things outside yourself. Inventions, adventures, alcohol. But meaning isn't out there, Rick. It's the moment you stop needing to chase it. Rick's voice cracked just slightly. You really think people like me can stop? She nodded. Not forever. But sometimes, long enough to remember why you started running at all. He laughed quietly, not mocking, but grateful. You're good at this. I practice, she said, smiling. He stared at the rain again. You ever think maybe I don't deserve quiet? She met his gaze. Quiet isn't a reward, Rick. It's a right. Rick blinked, slowly. A right. He rolled the word on his tongue like it was foreign. Wes, I've been living like I had to earn it. Dr. Wong's tone softened further. You don't earn peace. You allow it. They sat in silence for a long while after that. The clock ticked softly. The rain whispered against the glass. Finally, Rick stood. Well, thanks for the existential tune-up. Dr. Wong smiled. You're welcome. Same time next week. Rick chuckled. Let's not push it. As he reached the door, she said quietly, Rick, I'm glad you came back. He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes shimmered faintly. The kind of emotion he would normally hide behind sarcasm. Yeah, he said softly. Me too. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Rick stood under the awning, lighting a cigarette he never actually smoked. The smoke rose lazily, curling into the grey sky. He looked out over the wet city, not as a god, not as a genius, but as a man trying to be still. Maybe, he whispered, being broken's just another way to see the cracks in everything else. Then he smiled faintly, and for once it wasn't bitter. He flicked the cigarette into a puddle and watched it sizzle out. A tiny reflection stared back at him from the rippling water. His own. He didn't look away. The house was quiet. Not the awkward quiet of tension, but the tender kind that feels like a deep breath after years of holding one in. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind that soft, damp smell that always follows a storm, like the earth itself was cooling down. Rick sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pool of light spilling from a small desk lamp. It wasn't one of his inventions. Just an old lamp Beth had bought years ago at a yard sale. The bulb flickered every few seconds, not enough to annoy him, just enough to remind him it was alive. On the table before him sat 2 sandwiches, one half eaten, one untouched, and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. For once, his mind wasn't dissecting equations or debating the structure of time. It was simply floating. Morty padded into the kitchen, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket that trailed behind him like a sleepy ghost. His hair stuck up in every direction. He blinked at the light. "You're still up, Rick." Rick smirked softly. "You say that like I ever sleep." Morty shrugged, pulling out a chair across from him. "Yeah, but it's quieter tonight." "Thought maybe you were?" Rick chuckled, the sound low and tired. "Guess the universe is on mute for once." They sat there for a moment, just 2 silhouettes under a cone of light, surrounded by shadows. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded filling. It felt okay. Morty glanced at the untouched sandwich. "You made one for me." Rick gave a faint nod. "Didn't want you rummaging around the fridge at 3 a.m. again. You make too much noise." Morty smiled, pulling the plate toward him. "Thanks." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Rick didn't brush it off this time. He just nodded. Morty took a bite, chewing quietly. Then, after a pause, he said, I heard you went to therapy again." Rick raised an eyebrow. "You spying on me?" "Kid, no." Morty said quickly. "Beth told me. Said she was proud of you." Rick laughed, though it wasn't sarcastic. "Yeah, that's one word for it." Morty looked at him carefully. "How was it?" Rick leaned back, scratching the back of his neck. "Weird. Kinda like this." Morty smiled. "Guess that's not a bad thing." "Yeah," Rick murmured. "Guess not." A moth fluttered lazily near the lamp, circling it in a slow, hypnotic loop. Rick watched it for a while. "You ever think about how stupid light is?" he asked suddenly. Morty blinked. What?" "Light," Rick continued, "spends billions of years traveling across the universe, through dust gas, black holes, just to hit some idiot's kitchen wall and die there." Morty stared at him for a long moment. "That's kinda dark, Rick." Rick smirked. "It's honest." Morty thought for a second, then smiled softly. "Yeah, but it's also kinda nice, I guess. Like it made it all that way just so we could see it." Rick looked at him. "Since when did you start out philosophizing me, kid?" Morty grinned. "Since you stopped trying to." For a moment, Rick didn't reply. He just sat there, letting the words settle. The rain outside started again. Not heavy, just a faint drizzle tapping gently against the window. Rick tilted his head, listening. "You know," he said quietly, "for a long time I thought silence meant nothingness. That if I stopped, the noise would eat me alive." Morty's voice was soft. "And now?" Rick looked into the cup of cold coffee. His reflection rippled faintly. "Now I think maybe silence isn't empty. Maybe it's just waiting for you to notice it." Morty nodded slowly. "Wes, that's what Mom says about love." Rick chuckled quietly. "She's not wrong." The kitchen light flickered again, briefly plunging them into darkness before the warm glow returned. Morty shivered a little, Rick noticed. Without a word, he stood up, crossed to the coat rack, and pulled down an old flannel jacket, the one with burn holes and oil stains. He draped it over Morty's shoulders. "There," he said. "Now you look like a retired trucker." Morty laughed, tugging it tighter around himself. "Smells like engine grease and pickles." Rick smirked. "Yeah, that's called character." For a while, they just sat in the golden hum of the lamp. No portals, no chases, no universes collapsing. Just warmth. Rick leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes half closed. "You know, Morty, for all the chaos we've been through, I think this right here might be the strangest thing of all." "What?" Morty asked. Rick gestured vaguely. "This. Peace, no explosions, no lectures. Just this." Morty smiled sleepily. "Maybe that's the adventure you've been avoiding." Rick let out a soft, low laugh. "God, you're starting to sound like Wong." "Is that a bad thing?" Rick paused. "Not anymore." The clock on the wall ticked faintly. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on wet pavement. Somewhere a dog barked once, then stopped. Morty's eyes began to droop. His hand still clutched the sandwich, half-eaten. Rick watched him, his expression unreadable. For the first time in what felt like decades, he didn't feel the urge to move. He reached out, gently took the sandwich from Morty's hand and set it down. "Go on, kid," he whispered. "You've earned it." Morty mumbled something incoherent. Something like, "Night, Rick," and drifted off in the chair, head tilting slightly. Rick leaned back, exhaling softly. The lamp hummed. The moth landed on the rim of the shade, resting its wings. Rick stared at the small circle of light between them. How fragile it looked, how alive. For years, he'd chased infinite energy, infinite worlds, infinite everything. Now, here he was, in a kitchen, watching his grandson sleep, surrounded by nothing but silence and a flickering bulb. And for the first time, that was enough. He stood quietly, adjusted Morty's blanket so it wouldn't slip, and turned the lamp's brightness down until only a faint amber halo remained. Rick whispered, almost to himself, maybe peace isn't about stopping the noise. Maybe it's about learning to hum with it. He reached for his mug one last time, took a sip of cold coffee and smiled faintly. Outside, the rain sang softly against the roof, steady, gentle. Like a lullaby the universe had been trying to hum to him all along. He listened. And for once, he didn't need to answer back. The night was still, the kind of stillness that happens after the world exhales. Rick sat alone in the garage, bathed in the faint blue glow of his lab lights. The place was quiet, too quiet for anyone else, but for him it was perfect. The chaos of his mind, the noise of invention, the wild hum of portals, all of it had faded into a gentle hush. On the workbench in front of him stood the jar, that jar. The one that had once been his world, his prison, his lesson. The glass was clean now, polished so finely that it caught the reflections of the hanging bulbs above like trapped stars. Inside, only a faint residue shimmered, a trace of green brine, catching light like memory. Rick stared at it, not with pride or disgust, but with something quieter, something human. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the workbench. Maybe, he murmured, voice barely more than a breath. It wasn't such a stupid idea after all. The hum of the machines responded faintly, like an old friend clearing its throat. He reached for his flask, the one with the dent on the side, the dent from Morty's first real outburst years ago. He unscrewed it slowly, took a small sip, and then set it down beside the jar. You know, he whispered to the empty air, I thought I built this to escape, to avoid therapy, avoid family dinners, avoid all that messy, sentimental crap. He paused. Turns out I just needed a smaller universe to hear myself think. Rick chuckled quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from both irony and peace. He glanced around the lab, the empty test tubes, the half-built gadgets, the silent portal gun. For once, everything was off, no blinking lights, no sparks, just quiet existence. He swirled the flask absently and continued, I used to think my genius was the cure for everything, pain, loss, boredom, whatever. But all it ever did was keep me running from myself. He looked back at the jar. And you know what's funny? Inside there, I couldn't run anywhere, couldn't even move. Just think, sit with it, all of it. The night air drifted through the small open window, carrying the soft chirping of crickets and the distant hum of suburban life. Rick tilted his head back, looking through the cracked skylight above his workbench. The stars were out, faint behind the haze of the city, but enough. Enough to remind him that there were still things worth looking at, even if you'd seen every version of them across infinity. He whispered to himself, the stars don't need to know what they mean to shine. A small smile tugged at his lips. Footsteps padded lightly down the hall. Morty's voice, low and drowsy, drifted from the doorway. Rick, you're still out here. Rick didn't turn immediately.
Yeah, kid.
Couldn't sleep. Too much peace and quiet. Morty yawned, stepping closer, wrapped in his blanket again. Mum said you should at least try to sleep in a bed tonight. Rick snorted. Beds are overrated. You lie there pretending you're comfortable, staring at the ceiling until your brain remembers everything you've ever done wrong. This, he gestured to the cluttered lab, this is honest. Morty smiled faintly. You talking to the pickle jar again? Rick looked at him, then at the jar. Maybe, he said softly. It listens better than most people. Morty stepped closer and leaned on the bench beside him. The jar reflected both of their faces, one old and lined with exhaustion, the other young and heavy with unspoken worry. After a long pause, Morty said quietly, You ever think, maybe you turned into that thing because you needed to stop being you? Rick glanced at him, surprised. That's pretty deep for a kid who once got lost in a cereal aisle. Morty smiled faintly. Yeah, well, you're rubbing off on me. Rick chuckled, then sighed. Maybe. But don't pick up the bad habits. They stood there together for a while, saying nothing, just breathing. The brine inside the jar caught the light again, a slow shimmer like a pulse. Rick reached out and turned the lamp down a notch until the glow was softer, gentler. You know, he said quietly, I used to think being alone made me strong. Now I think it just made me scared. Morty looked at him, eyes half closed from sleep. Scared of what? Rick took a moment. Of what happens when you stop running, of what's left when the noise goes away. Morty didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and placed his hand on Rick's. Just for a second. A small, human gesture. You don't have to run tonight, he said softly. Rick stared at him. No sarcasm, no quick comeback. Just a slow, grateful exhale. Yeah, he murmured. I think I'll stay put. Morty yawned again. You coming to bed, Rick? In a bit, Rick said gently. Go on. I'll close up. Morty nodded, gave a sleepy wave and shuffled back toward the hallway. When the door clicked shut, the garage was quiet again, except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint patter of the rain starting up outside. Rick stared at the jar one last time. The reflection of the ceiling lights looked like tiny stars trapped in the brine. He leaned forward and whispered, maybe somewhere out there, there's still a version of me floating in this jar, still trying to figure it out. He smiled faintly, eyes half-lidded. Hope he's doing better than I did. Rick leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. The hum of the machines blended with the rain, creating a rhythm like breathing, the slow inhale and exhale of a universe finally at rest. Outside, thunder rumbled far away, not loud, just enough to remind him that the world was still moving. Rick whispered softly, and somewhere, maybe, he's still floating in that jar, dreaming of stars in brine. He tilted his head toward the ceiling, the faint smile still on his face. Thanks for staying up with me tonight, kid, he murmured to the empty air, though maybe it wasn't empty at all. He exhaled slowly, letting the silence take him, not into sleep but into stillness. The lights dimmed, the rain softened, and the sound of his breathing melted into the quiet hum of the lab. Everything was okay.